Hi there everyone, this is Bob Martin, the RCSubGuy again, and I have, over the course of the last short while, applied some paint to this monstrous German Type 21 remote-controlled submarine project. This is 1/30th scale, so it's a big beastie. I got the paint all completed, well, mostly completed to the main part of it, and posted up a couple of pictures on social media, and I got a lot of responses from people saying, well, how did you do that? Now, I did not do a step-by-step as I went write-up or video blog on this because honestly, it was trial and error, and I wasn't sure that it was going to work. I took a few steps forward, a step back, a few steps forward, and this is what I ended up with. So I'm going to verbally run through how I accomplished the finish on this submarine. You can take a look. If you like it, you can utilize these hints, and if you don't, feel free to experiment on your own. I really don't think there's a wrong way of going about it. Let's start out by taking a look at the finish, and you can decide for yourself if it's something you want to try and emulate. So here's a look at the overall boat. I'm standing about 6 feet away from it, and I personally really like the looks of it. Now, if we go back to the Type 21 project, these entered the war very, very late. And if I'm not mistaken, only 2 of them ended up on active patrol. So therefore, these boats would not have been out on the ocean for very long. And as such, they would not see a ton of rust, weathering, and algae buildup like you might see with some of the more populous and older Type 7, Type 9 boats. So what we've got here is sort of the standard German paint scheme. We've got a light gray on top with a black line at the waterline, dark gray beneath it. I've got just some rust marks all along the seams, along the weld lines, around some of the panels here, and of course on the conning tower, around the doors, seam lines, ladders, etc. Below, you don't see a lot of streaking below the water line, so you're not going to see running rust, but you do see some degree of algae, and then I just did some subtle streaking with some pastels on there as well. So that's the overall look. Now that you've seen that, you can decide if you like it. Let's talk about what I did to accomplish it. So like any project where you're going to be painting, you want to make sure that you've got a strong foundation and a good bond for your paint to the model. The entire model prior to painting was sanded with a light coarseness of sandpaper to rough up the finish and give the paint something to adhere to. Following that, I used a Rust-Oleum Automotive Primer. This is a black version of it that I've come to like a lot because it goes on nice and smooth, and of course I like the color as well. What you're going to find is actually I don't have any super special paints or pigments to paint this model. The vast majority of it is off-the-shelf kind of stuff that you can get from your local hardware store. So first coat over the whole thing, Rust-Oleum Automotive Primer. Starting from the bottom and working our way up, I've used another Rust-Oleum product called Chalked Ultra Matte Paint in charcoal. It's not chalkboard paint, it's simply called chalked because of the very matte finish to the paint. So this is Rust-Oleum Chalked charcoal color for the bottom of the boat up to the waterline, as a little bit of a hint for any application of spray paint. Less is more. Several light coats versus one heavy coat is always better. You can rough up each individual coat in between with a very fine grit sandpaper to knock down any blobs or paint speckles that you end up on there for the most smooth finish that you can achieve. Next color at the waterline is another Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 flat black. I've come to not like this 2-in-1 paint. I used to like it a lot, but for whatever reason, I think they've changed the formulation. I actually find with this paint, it ends up with some like speckling, and the paint separates almost like an oil blot in there, despite you know, extremely intensive preparation of the model underneath. This was fine for a black stripe going across the boat. But I would stay clear if you're looking to paint like a nuclear boat or something like that with this. Don't like it. Go with that Automotive Primer that I talked about, that super dark gray color. It'll get a much smoother finish, and of course you want a matte finish versus semi-gloss or gloss. For heaven's sakes, do not paint those boats in gloss. They look terrible. Upper color. And this really is, again, open to a little bit of interpretation. I used another Rust-Oleum light gray primer. This was actually a filler primer that I like to use, especially on models that don't have a lot of surface detail on them, as this is so big it doesn't. So we wanted to fill in as much as I could. Painted it the color. I said that color looks great, let's just keep it. So this is Rust-Oleum filler primer in gray, and that's what you see on the model from the waterline up, including the conning tower. All right, let's talk about the actual weathering of the boat. Now you'll notice if you take a look on the model, everywhere that there's a panel line, it's just a little bit darker. And what I did is I used my airbrush and sprayed on some acrylic flat black paint. I used Tamiya's acrylic paints. I actually kind of like them. They airbrush really, really well, especially if you thin them down with just a little bit of water. So this is actually just a straight flat black paint. You follow all of the panel lines really, really lightly. If you get too much on there, you can go back over it with that primer gray, blot it back out again, and then go back over with the black. On the bottom, what I actually ended up doing was the opposite. I went and filled in all of the main panel areas down below here with a slightly lighter shade of gray, leaving the original primer color along the seam line. So it accomplished the same thing, I just did it reversed. Now we are talking about rust, and this is a technique that I developed a little while ago on my U-boats, and what I use for this is, again, Tamiya flat base color, and then what I do is I mix it up with a gritty yellow pastel, and what you're kind of looking for is a bright orange color. I got this in a set of a whole bunch of colors. I don't even know if there's a brand name on it that I could recite to you. But any pastels from a hobby shop, you can use sandpaper to grind up if they're in pencil form, or if you can find them in powder form, that's great. And then all you do is you just mix it together, and you can see I did that on this little palette that I've got here. And you almost make a little bit of mud. And then what you do is fill that in. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit for you here. Paint it into the creases, and then before it dries, and it will dry very, very quickly, just take your finger and rub it downwards. And that'll create some really cool streaking effects. It'll wipe it clear of the main areas, and it'll keep it focused along the seams that you are trying to rust. What you're going to end up with, and don't get discouraged or put off from it, is really these really bright color, almost yellow areas across the whole thing. It's going to look really bad, to be blunt, at that particular point, but do not get discouraged. We are not done yet. After all of that, I took this Tamiya brown, dark brown color, and added to the center part of each one of that rust, that dark brown color. And you can again do the streaking with your fingers. I also went in and did some like paint chipping, just little touches along the hull. And this is really representative of where the paint bubbled and broke open to show the hull underneath. So you're going to go around and do that along all of the areas where that rust is. You're going to want to put some, sort of at the origin of the rust, and then use that yellow as a streak going down. So all that done, you've got sort of like a bright yellow rust streaking down the whole thing. It looks very neon and kind of terrible. What we're going to use here is matte clear Rust-Oleum paint, and you are going to mist over the entire upper hull section of the boat. And what you're going to see is all that really terrible bright yellow is going to get toned down immensely, and it's going to turn into some really, really dynamic different colors. Like rust has many, many different colors. It's not just one color. You've got that dark red sort of origin color, and then the yellowish, dark orangish streaking, and then light orange where it oxidizes a little bit closer to the surface where it thins. So this allows all of those colors to kind of shine through by using this clear. Go slow, again, multiple light coats. The more layers you put on it, the less you're gonna see the bright yellow color. I would say you still want to have some of that showing, so don't completely obliterate it. As I showed you earlier, there's still some just in the little creases and corners here and there. So this will also act to seal everything in. Flat clear is what you're going to put over the top of everything. So now we're going to talk about the last part, and that's the lower hull streaking. I really like how this turned out. It added a lot of visual interest to this, and this is accomplished again with a pastel powder. This is called highlight white, but basically just white, pure white. And what I did is I put that down on my workbench and I rubbed my shop cloth on it. And this is kind of what it would look like once you've got it on there. You're gonna rub this on a clean spot until you're just barely getting a little bit of white off of it if you press. And then what you're gonna end up doing is just taking your rag and starting from that water line, rubbing down, a downward motion, going all the way over, maybe working like a 6-inch section, going down, back and forth, fill all of it in, and you're going to end up with this streaking. If it's too bright, use a clean area of your rag, rub it down. If there's too much of a demarcation between where it originates and where it terminates, rub that down. You can achieve some really, really subtle sort of streaking and hull differentiation going on utilizing this technique. And the other thing is that by rubbing it in very hard on this very matte finish, you're actually embedding those particles in the finish and it won't come off. You don't actually need to seal it afterwards. If you do, it's really going to hide all of that. So it's not a terribly bad thing. It'll just make it incredibly subtle. I like this the way it is. I'm not going to clear it. So we're going to leave that the way it is. But as I said before, you really just need to play with this until you feel like it looks right. The last thing I did on the lower hull was just to use some of that same paint that we used on the upper hull, that dark brown paint, and I just touched, these weld lines, the seams in between, just here and there, not over the whole thing, and I didn't do any in the middle, but just to add a little bit more color, more visual interest to the lower part of the hull. All right, we're going to continue this weathering a little bit more, and again, I'm going to use these pastels, and I really kind of love them. Looking closely at this, you can see it's actually fairly, monochromatic. There's big areas of just kind of like gray. I'm going to weather that up just a little bit more, not with rust, but just with a little bit of like grunge. And the way that I'm going to do that is with like a dark gray, almost black pastel in there. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to drag this from the panel lines down. I'm going to rub that in a downward motion, and you can see immediately you get this really kind of cool streaking effect going on in there, and it helps break up these big panels into something a little bit more visually interesting. And again, I'm rubbing with a fair degree of pressure. We're going to make sure that that pastel chalk gets pushed into the finish there. Using these panel lines as a guide, and like what I said before, if you don't like it, if it's a little bit too dark, get a clean area of your rag. You can rub that, and it'll help to smooth everything out. So I'm going to continue doing this, and I'll show you the finished product. And there is the finished product. Again, subtle, but it breaks up those big open gray areas, and just makes the boat look like it's been out doing stuff. Well, there you go, everyone. That is my very brief tutorial on how I personally weathered this particular boat to begin with. There's going to be some more going on probably later on, but that's the meat and potatoes of how I weathered this German Type 21 boat. I really hope that you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, by all means, reach out to me anytime, bob@rc-sub.com. I would love to hear from you. Again, this is Bob Martin, the RC Sub Guy. Visit my website, nautilusdrydocks.com. I got lots of cool stuff there, information, resources, kits, components, and resources for you to take a look at in this marvelous hobby of remote-controlled submarines. Thanks for joining me, everyone. We will catch you next time.